The Inupiaq word for the sound is naluagnignig. I had to ask 3 times before anyone would translate it for me, and when they did, the closest English equivalent was something like the voice of something pretending to listen. I thought it was a figure of speech. It took me 4 months to understand it was a technical description. I need to back up. In November of 2021, a broadband acoustic signal was detected by NOAA hydrophone station H-11, moored at depth in the western Beaufort Sea, roughly 190 nautical miles north-northwest of Utqiagvik. The signal lasted 97 seconds. It was not a whale. It was not ice fracture. It was not anthropogenic. No vessel traffic, no seismic survey, no military sonar exercise registered within 400 nautical miles during the detection window. The frequency content was analyzed at the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory in Seattle, and the spectral signature matched nothing in their database. Not similar to nothing. Matched nothing. Every known source, biological, geological, mechanical, was excluded with confidence intervals above 99%. PMEL published a brief internal memo classifying it as unresolved, which in that community means it gets added to a list and nobody works on it because there is no funding line for sounds that shouldn't exist. I wouldn't have known about any of this. I'm not a federal oceanographer, I'm not military. I was, at the time, a marine mammal observer under contract with the North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management. Had been for 6 years. My job was counting bowhead whales during the spring migration from shore-based observation points along the Chukchi coast, collecting tissue samples from the fall subsistence harvest, and assisting with acoustic monitoring of beluga and bowhead aggregation patterns using a small network of hydrophones the Borough maintained independently of NOAA. The work was seasonal, but the commitment was year-round. You don't do that job for 6 years unless you have a reason to stay, and my reason was that I'd married into a family that had been there for longer than anyone had been mapping. My wife, Nang Garak, grew up in Utqiagvik. Her father had been a whaling captain. Her uncle still was. I was the outsider they'd accepted because I did the work, learned what I could, and didn't assume my education entitled me to opinions about things I hadn't lived. The signal came to my attention because of Ruth Tagalik. Ruth was the Borough's senior acoustics technician. She'd been doing hydrophone work for the Borough since the late 1990s and had personally maintained the coastal array through 3 complete hardware generations. If Ruth flagged something, you paid attention because she didn't flag things. She processed data. She identified species, classified ambient noise sources, noted equipment degradation, filed reports. She did not speculate. I had never once heard her say, "I don't know what this is." In January of 2022, she said it to me in the hallway outside the Wildlife Management office. She was carrying a USB drive and her face had the expression I'd only seen on her once before when a beluga aggregation she'd been tracking disappeared from the acoustic record overnight and reappeared 11 days later 200 miles east with no transit signal in between. That had turned out to be an equipment malfunction, or at least that was the conclusion she accepted. This time, she didn't offer any conclusion. She said she'd been reviewing archived data from the Borough's own nearshore array, 3 units positioned at 30, 60, and 90 meters depth along a transect running northwest from Point Barrow. During a routine audit of the fall 2021 recordings, she'd found something. Not the NOAA signal. She didn't know about the NOAA signal yet. She'd found the Borough Array's version of it, the same 97-second event, captured independently on all 3 hydrophones at slightly different times consistent with the signal's propagation through water at known speed from a source to the northwest. The waveform was identical to what PMEL would later confirm they'd recorded on H-11. Same duration. Same frequency structure. Same spectral signature matching nothing in existence. But Ruth's data had something PMELs didn't. The burrow array was positioned close enough to shore that ambient biological noise was present in the recording bowhead vocalizations, bearded seal trills, the broadband crackle of shore-fast ice. And every one of those ambient sources went silent 4 seconds before the signal arrived. Not gradually, simultaneously, as if every living thing in the water column within detection range stopped vocalizing at the same instant. Ruth had checked the timestamp against environmental data. Air temperature, barometric pressure, tidal state, wind nothing anomalous. No seismic precursor that might have startled the animals. No vessel, no aircraft. She'd checked the sea ice synthetic aperture radar imagery for the hour before and after. Nothing moving. She'd checked with the subsistence hunters who'd been out that week. None of them had reported anything unusual on the water. She'd checked everything she could think to check, and then she'd carried a USB drive down the hallway and said she didn't know what it was. I asked her what she wanted me to do with the information. She said she didn't want me to do anything yet. She wanted me to listen to it. She wanted a second set of ears, someone with experience differentiating biological sources from non-biological ones, someone who wouldn't immediately try to make it fit a category. I took the drive home that night. Nang Garak was at her mother's. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. I put on the studio headphones I used for spectrogram review, plugged them into my laptop, and played the file. The ambient sound was normal for November in the nearshore Beaufort. Distant ice stress, the faint rhythmic pulsing of a bowhead somewhere to the east, the hiss of current against the hydrophone housing. Then it stopped. All of it. Not a fade, a cut. 4 seconds of absolute hydroacoustic silence, which, if you've done this work, you know doesn't happen. Water is never silent. There's always thermal noise, biological noise, ice noise. Water transmits sound better than air. You cannot get silence in water. And then the signal started. I will not attempt to describe what it sounded like because the 3 times I've tried, I've used different words, and none of them were accurate. I will say that my first physical reaction was to pull the headphones off, and my second reaction was that the house felt smaller than it had 30 seconds ago. I sat in the kitchen and stared at the playback timeline on the screen. 97 seconds. I played it again. The same reaction, not fear exactly, but a spatial discomfort, as if the sound was generating a cavity in the room and I was sitting inside it. I played it 4 more times that night. By the 4th listen, I'd started isolating frequency bands in Audacity, trying to find a structure I could identify. There was structure, clear structure, repeating motifs at intervals that were too regular to be geological and too complex to be mechanical. They weren't biological in any pattern I recognized from 6 years of cetacean acoustics. But they weren't random. I kept the headphones on for 2 hours, and when I finally took them off, the kitchen clock showed 1:40 a.m., and I realized I'd missed a radio check-in I was supposed to make at 9 p.m. for an ongoing beluga tracking project. I reported the missed check-in the next morning. Nobody cared. It was winter. Dark 20 hours a day. People missed things. I went to see Ruth at the office and told her I wanted to see the raw spectrogram, not the audio playback. She pulled it up. On screen, the signal's frequency content spread across a range from roughly 14 Hz to just above 22,000 Hz, spanning the entire range of human hearing and extending below it. The spectrogram looked organized, layered. There were at least 4 distinct frequency bands operating simultaneously, and within each band the energy wasn't continuous, it pulsed in packets. Each packet lasted between 1.3 and 1.7 seconds, with gaps of 0.4 to 0.6 seconds between them. The packets weren't identical. They varied in frequency, content, and amplitude. But the timing, the rhythmic spacing, was consistent enough that you could have set a metronome to it. Ruth had already done the math I was about to suggest. She'd auto-correlated the signal to check for internal repetition. There was a repeating macro structure at a period of approximately 19.4 seconds, meaning the entire 97-second signal contained almost exactly 5 cycles of a 19.4-second pattern. Almost exactly. The actual count was 4.97 cycles. Ruth said she'd stared at that number for 20 minutes. A natural signal doesn't terminate at 4.97 cycles of its own repeating structure. It either completes the 5th cycle or it doesn't. This signal stopped 0.6 seconds before completing the 5th repetition, as if it had been cut off, or as if completion was not the point. We agreed not to share the data outside the borough office until we'd done more analysis. Ruth was cautious by nature and by professional necessity. The borough's acoustic monitoring program was funded in part through cooperative agreements with federal agencies, and she knew that flagging an anomaly this significant would invite external attention, NOAA, ONR, possibly the Navy, and external attention in Utqiagvik had a history of taking data and not returning results. I spent the next 2 weeks working on the signal analysis whenever I wasn't on shift. My contract work that winter was light. The bowhead migration wouldn't start until April, and my monitoring duties were limited to maintaining equipment and reviewing passive acoustic data for beluga presence near Elson Lagoon. I had time. I used it. By the end of January, I had mapped the internal structure of the signal in enough detail to write a paper, if I'd wanted to. I didn't want to. What I wanted was for the structure to resolve into something identifiable. It didn't. Every analytical path I followed led to the same conclusion. The signal had characteristics of a communication structured, non-random, internally consistent, spectrally complex, but it was not produced by any known animal, and the frequency range and source level were inconsistent with any human technology deployed in the Arctic that I could find documentation for. I checked with contacts at the Applied Physics Lab. I sent a sanitized spectral summary, no location data, no source attribution to a colleague at Scripps who specialized in unidentified acoustic events. He called me back within a day. He said the spectral content was unlike anything in his database and asked where it was recorded. I told him I'd get back to him. I never did, because by February the signal had recurred. Ruth found it first. She'd set up an automated detection algorithm using the original signal's spectral template as a match filter, running it against the real-time feed from the nearshore array. On February 9th, the algorithm triggered. Same signature. Same duration, 97 seconds. Same frequency structure. Same internal periodicity of 19.4 seconds. Same termination at the incomplete 5th cycle, and the same 4 seconds of biological silence preceding it. But the new signal had one difference. The source bearing, triangulated from the 3 hydrophones, had shifted. In November, the signal had originated from approximately 340 degrees, true, almost due north-northwest, consistent with an open water or under ice source well offshore. In February, the bearing was 312 degrees. The source had moved, or a different source producing an identical signal had activated at a different location. Ruth calculated the approximate distance based on received levels and transmission loss models. Both signals appeared to originate from roughly the same range between 140 and 170 nautical miles from the array. She plotted the 2 bearings on a chart. The November position was in deep water off the continental shelf. The February position was closer to the shelf break, where the bottom rises from 3,000 meters to about 200 meters over a distance of maybe 40 miles. She came to find me with the chart. She didn't say anything at first. She just put it on the table and let me look. The 2 bearing lines were drawn in pencil. The November line pointed into the abyss. The February line pointed to where the abyss ends and the continental shelf begins. as if the source had moved from deep water toward the coast. I asked Ruth how confident she was in the bearing estimates. She said plus or minus 8 degrees, which at that range meant the positional uncertainty was large, maybe 30 to 40 miles. So the apparent shift could be within the margin of error, or it could be real movement. There was no way to tell from 2 data points. We needed more. The third detection came on March 3rd, bearing 295 degrees, closer to due west, estimated range 130 to 160 nautical miles. Still far offshore, still deep water, but the bearing had shifted again in the same rotational direction clockwise, from 340 to 312 to 295, and the range estimates were tightening. Ruth didn't plot this one on the chart in front of me. She plotted it later, at home, and called me at 10 p.m. to say that if you drew a line through the 3 positions, accounting for uncertainty, the best fit track was a gentle arc curving from the northwest toward the southwest. Not a straight line, a curve, consistent with something following the shelf break, moving generally south along the continental margin. I asked her what she thought it was. She said she didn't think about it. She measured it. I recognized the discipline in that answer and respected it. But I also knew she was afraid, because Ruth Tagalic did not call people at 10 p.m. about data she wasn't afraid of. The fourth detection came on March 19th, bearing 278 degrees, range estimate 120 to 150 nautical miles. The arc was holding. The source was tracking south-southwest along the shelf break at an average speed of, Ruth calculated this without my asking, approximately 0.3 knots. Walking speed, except nothing walks along the shelf break at 200 meters depth under 6 feet of sea ice in the Arctic winter. It was after the fourth detection that I made the decision I've been thinking about ever since. I contacted PMEL. I didn't go through Ruth. I didn't go through the borough. I sent an email to Dr. Robert Desiak, who had published the PMEL memo about the November detection on H-11. I told him I had independent corroborating data from a nearshore array, including 3 subsequent detections with bearing information suggesting a mobile source. I attached a summary, no raw data, just the analysis. He responded in 4 hours. He wanted the raw data. He wanted the hydrophone specifications. He wanted to know the exact array position, which was not public. He copied 2 people I didn't recognize on the reply. I didn't respond that night. The next morning, Ruth was waiting for me in the office. She knew. Not because I told her, because Ziak had independently contacted the borough's wildlife management director, asking about their acoustic monitoring capabilities. The director had asked Ruth what was going on. Ruth had told him, truthfully, that she'd identified an anomalous signal in the fall data and was still analyzing it. The director told her that a PMEL researcher had called, asking about exactly this type of signal and referencing corroborating data from an unnamed local source. Ruth put it together. She wasn't angry. She was something worse. She was quiet, and she closed my office door, and she sat down, and she said, "You need to talk to my mother." I didn't understand. Ruth said her mother, Mary Tagalic, was 74 years old and had grown up in a traditional camp near Wainwright before the family moved to Utqiagvik in the 1960s. Ruth said her mother had heard the signal. Not on a hydrophone. Not in a recording. She had heard it from shore, in open air, standing on the ice near Point Barrow in the winter of 1978. And she had a name for it, and the name was older than her mother, and her mother's mother, and whatever came before that. I went to see Mary Tagalic the following evening. She lived in a small house on Akavak Street with a window that faced the sea ice. She made tea. She did not ask me why I was there. She told me Ruth had said I would come, and she waited. I told her about the signal. I played the audio on my phone without headphones at low volume. I watched her face. When the playback started, the ambient noise, the silence, and then the signal, she closed her eyes and kept them closed for the full 97 seconds. When it ended, she opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as confirmation. Not surprise, not wonder. Recognition, but deeply sad. The way you'd recognize the voice of someone you'd been hoping would never call again. She told me the sound had been known to the Inupiaq people on the North Slope for as long as anyone could trace. Not constantly, not every year. It came in cycles. Sometimes decades passed without it. Sometimes it came several times in a single winter. It came from the water. It came from below the ice. It came, she said, from somewhere that was not the ocean, but used the ocean to speak. The word naluanignig, the voice of something pretending to listen, was not a name for the sound itself. It was a description of what happened when you heard it. Because the sound, according to Mary, listened back. I am a marine biologist by training. I have a master's degree from the University of Washington. I have published peer-reviewed papers on bowhead whale acoustic behavior. I believe in measurement. I believe in data. I sat in that kitchen and listened to a 74-year-old woman explain to me that the sound I had been analyzing for 3 months was aware of its audience. And I did not dismiss her. I did not dismiss her because the data supported her. The biological silence preceding each detection, the simultaneous cessation of every living sound source in the water column, was consistent with a response to something, not a coincidence. The animals heard it coming. They stopped. Every time, 4 seconds before it arrived, every animal in range went quiet. That is not a response to a random noise. That is a response to a signal that has been present long enough for a behavioral avoidance pattern to evolve. I asked Mary what the tradition said about the cycles, when the sound came and when it went silent. She said the old understanding was that it came closer in some periods and retreated in others, and that the closer it came, the more it sounded like it was answering rather than calling. She said the dangerous time was not when you heard it from far away. The dangerous time was when it began to sound close enough that you could mistake it for something familiar, a whale, a motor, a voice on the ice. She said the people who got into trouble were the ones who went looking for the source, because looking for it was the same as answering it, and answering it was the same as inviting it closer. I asked her what happened when it got close. She said she didn't know. She said her grandmother had known, and her grandmother would not say. I left Mary's house and drove to the office, and it was 9 p.m. dark. The temperature was minus 28 Fahrenheit, and the wind was calm, and the sky was clear enough that the stars looked like they'd been punched through the atmosphere with a needle. I sat in my truck in the parking lot with the engine running and the heater on, and thought about the track Ruth had plotted. Northwest to southwest, following the shelf break, getting closer. 0.3 knots. I went inside and pulled up the detection log. 4 events, November 4th, February 9th, March 3rd, March 19th. The intervals were shrinking. November to February, 97 days. February to March 3rd, 22 days. March 3rd to March 19th, 16 days. If the pattern held, the next detection would come within 10 to 12 days. And the bearing would be further south, further along the shelf break, further toward the coast. I set up a second detection algorithm on my own laptop, mirroring Ruth's template, but running against a broader frequency band in case the signal characteristics shifted slightly between occurrences. I configured email alerts. I went home. 10 days later, March the 29th, my phone buzzed at 3:17 a.m. detection. I was out of bed and at the laptop within minutes. The recording had already been captured. I played it. Same signal, same 97 seconds. Same structure, same biological silence. Bearing, 261 degrees true. Range estimate, 100 to 130 nautical miles. It was south-southwest of us now, and it was closer by at least 20 nautical miles compared to the last detection. Still far offshore, still under ice. But the arc was unmistakable. I didn't need Ruth's confirmation to see it. The source was following the continental shelf break, curving south and east, and the range was decreasing. Ruth confirmed the bearing the next morning. She didn't plot it on the chart this time. She put the chart away. She said, "I talked to my mother again last night. She said Mary had told her something she hadn't shared with me. Mary said the sound had come in 1978, and again in 1979. In 1978 it was faint and distant and came from the north. In 1979 it was louder and came from the west. And in the spring of 1979, 3 hunters from Wainwright went out on the ice during the spring whaling season and did not come back. Their boat was found. Their gear was found. No bodies. No sign of ice breakup or storm damage. The search was called off after 6 days. The official cause was listed as exposure following an unwitnessed ice event. Mary told Ruth that the families of those hunters did not believe the official finding. They believed the men had followed the sound onto the ice because they thought it was a whale. They believed the sound had made itself sound like a whale, and they believed this because one of the hunters, the youngest, a man named Thomas Sikvayugak, had told his wife the night before they left that he'd heard a bowhead calling from an impossible direction, from the west-northwest, from a bearing where the ice was solid to the horizon and no whale could possibly be. His wife told him not to follow it. He told her it was the clearest bowhead call he'd ever heard, and that it meant there must be a lead in the ice they didn't know about. He was right that the call was clear. He was wrong about everything else. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table and ran projections. If the source continued along the shelf break at the same average speed and the bearing continued to rotate, the track would bring it roughly parallel to the coast by late April or early May. The closest approach to shore would depend on exactly where the shelf break curved. But in some places along the north slope, the shelf break comes within 50 nautical miles of the coast. At 0.3 knots, the source could reach that closest approach by mid to late April. April was the beginning of the spring bowhead migration, the time when hunters would be out on the sea ice, listening for whales. I went to the Borough Wildlife Management Director the next morning and told him everything. The NOAA signal, Ruth's detections, the bearing track, the bearing toward the coast, the accelerating interval, the 1978 to 79 history for Mary, the missing hunters. I told him I believed the signal source was approaching the coast and would reach its nearest point during the spring whaling season, and that the signal had characteristics that might cause it to be mistaken for a bowhead vocalization at close range by experienced hunters on the ice. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he picked up his phone and made a call. He spoke in Inupiaq for several minutes. I caught only fragments. I understood enough of the language for daily conversation, but not for whatever this was. The tone was serious and unhurried. He hung up and told me 3 things. First, he said the Borough was aware of historical reports consistent with what I was describing, going back to oral accounts from the 1800s. He said there was no written record because the knowledge was maintained within whaling families and was not shared with outside researchers. He said he had not told me about this background because I had not needed to know until now. Second, he said PMEL had contacted the Borough again, this time through the regional NOAA office, requesting access to the nearshore array data. He said the Borough had declined. He said the decision was made by the Whaling Captains Association, not by the Wildlife Management Office, and it was final. Third, he said I was being removed from the acoustic monitoring project effective immediately. Not fired, reassigned. My contract would be honored for the remaining season. I would do visual bowhead counts from shore during the spring migration as originally scheduled. I would not have access to the hydrophone data. I would not contact PMEL or any other outside agency about the signal. He said this was not a punishment but a boundary, and that the boundary existed because some things were managed by the community in ways that did not translate into my professional framework. And attempting to force that translation had historically caused more harm than the phenomenon itself. I sat in that office and felt the entire structure of my professional life, measurement, analysis, publication, the idea that understanding required sharing and verification come into contact with the wall I couldn't see through. The director was not hostile. He was calm. He thanked me for my diligence. He said Ruth would continue monitoring and that the whaling captains would be informed through channels that existed for exactly this purpose. He said the community had survived this before. He said it always came back and it always left. He did not tell me what happened when it arrived. I spent April on the ice at my observation point near Point Barrow, counting bowheads through a spotting scope. The migration was good that year. Strong numbers, healthy animals, calves present. The weather cooperated. The ice was stable. The whaling crews went out and came back. I did not hear anything unusual. I did not have access to the hydrophone data. I watched the sea and counted and logged and tried not to think about the bearing track and the accelerating interval and the fact that, by my last projection, the source should have been at its closest approach to shore during the second week of April. Nothing happened, or nothing I was told about. In May, after the migration counts were complete, I went back to the office to file my final reports. Ruth was there. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not sleep-deprived, but depleted, as if something had been drawn out of her over weeks. I asked if the signal had recurred. She said she couldn't discuss it. I asked if the whaling season had been safe. She said everyone came home. I asked if the detection algorithm was still running. She said the nearshore array had been pulled for maintenance on April 8th and would not be redeployed until the fall. April 8th. My projection had the closest approach starting around April 11th. They'd pulled the array 3 days before the source would have been at its nearest point. They'd blinded themselves on purpose, or they'd blinded me. I stood in the hallway and looked at Ruth and understood that the array was not pulled for maintenance. It was pulled so there would be no recording of whatever happened during closest approach. No data, no spectrogram, no file on a USB drive that someone like me might feel compelled to share with someone at Scripps or PMEL or anywhere else. The community had its own way of handling the sound. That way did not include creating records. I finished my contract that summer. Nangarak and I talked about whether to stay. She wanted to stay. Her family was there, her work was there, the only landscape she'd ever known was there. I wanted to stay too. I'd built a life in Utqiagvik, a professional identity, relationships with people who did work I believed in. But I also knew that I'd been shown the edge of something and then walled off from it, and I didn't know whether the wall was to protect me or to protect it. We stayed. I got a new contract to the following fall visual survey work, no acoustics. I didn't push for hydrophone access. I didn't contact PMEL. I didn't call my colleague at Scripps. I let it go, or I thought I did. In October of 2022, I was home alone, Nangarak visiting family in Wainwright. I'd been reviewing that season's Bowhead Photo ID catalog on my laptop. Routine work. Matching fluke photographs to the existing database. I had the house quiet except for the wind against the north-facing window. At some point, I didn't note the time, which is the kind of mistake I don't make. I became aware that the wind had stopped, not died down, stopped. The house was silent in a way that houses in Utqiagvik are never silent in October, Because there is always wind. I sat still. I became aware of a pressure in my ears, the kind you feel when you descend an elevation. Except I was at sea level in a house on Akovac Street. And then I heard it. Not through a hydrophone, not through headphones, through the wall of my house, through the air. Faint, but unmistakable, the layered, pulsing structure I had spent weeks mapping on a spectrogram. The 1.3 to 1.7 second packets. The 0.4 to 0.6 second gaps. The rhythmic periodicity I could have identified in my sleep. It lasted 97 seconds. I counted. I sat at my kitchen table and counted the seconds on my watch while the sound moved through the wall and through me, and filled the room with the same spatial wrongness I'd felt the first time I'd heard the recording, except this wasn't a recording. This was live. This was in the air. This was November. And if the cycle was repeating, the source was starting from the northwest again, but this time I could hear it without a hydrophone, which meant it was either much closer or much louder or both. When it stopped, the wind came back, immediately, as if it had been paused rather than absent. The house creaked and settled, and the furnace cycled on, and the normal sounds of a coastal Arctic night resumed, as if they'd never left. I sat in the kitchen for an hour. I did not play the original recording to compare. I did not open my laptop. I did not call Ruth. I did not call anyone. I sat and listened to the wind in the furnace and the house and waited for the sound to come back. It didn't. Not that night. I called Ruth the next morning. I told her what I'd heard. There was a pause long enough that I checked the phone to see if the call had dropped. Then she said, "I know, I heard it too." She said 3 other people had called the wildlife management office that morning to report an unusual sound. All 3 were elders. All 3 had heard it before. I asked Ruth if the nearshore array was deployed. She said it was. I asked if it had detected anything. Another pause. Then she said, the array didn't record anything. The detection algorithm didn't trigger. The hydrophones show ambient noise through the entire period. Normal ice, normal bioacoustics, no anomaly. The instruments heard nothing. The people heard it through their walls. I asked Ruth what that meant. She said it meant the sound wasn't in the water anymore. I am writing this from Fairbanks. Nangarak and I moved here in the summer of 2023. She took a position with the Tribal Health Consortium. I took a teaching job at the university, Introductory Biology, Marine Science elective. Nothing that requires me to listen to recordings from the Beaufort Sea. We have an apartment near campus. It is warm and small and 500 miles from the coast. I have not accessed the NOAA hydrophone database since we moved. I have not contacted Ruth. I have not contacted PMEL, Scripps, or anyone else in the acoustics community. I filed no papers. I published nothing. The data I collected, my copies of the spectrograms, the detection logs, the bearing plots, is on an encrypted drive in a locked drawer in my office at home. I don't open the drawer. Last month, May 2024, I received an email from a graduate student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, a woman in the oceanography program who had come across the original PMEL internal memo about the 2021 H11 detection. She was looking for someone with Arctic acoustic monitoring experience to advise on a proposal to deploy a temporary hydrophone array along the shelf break north of Utqiagvik. She wanted to capture the signal if it recurred. She wanted to characterize the source. She wanted to understand it. I read her email twice. I started to reply. I got 3 sentences in and stopped because I realized I was about to describe the bearing track, the accelerating interval, the approach. I was about to hand her the exact information that would compel her to go to the coast and listen. I deleted the draft. A week later, she emailed again. She said she'd found my name on an old borough wildlife management report and noticed I'd been stationed in Utqiagvik during the detection period. She asked if I had any first-hand observations. I wrote back one sentence. I told her to contact the North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management directly, and that any data from that region was under their authority. I don't know if she did. I don't know if they told her anything. I don't know if Ruth is still monitoring, or if the array is deployed this season, or if the sound came back this past winter. I don't know if the elders heard it again through their walls. I don't know if the whaling crews went out safely. I know this. 2 nights ago, I woke at 2 a.m. in my apartment in Fairbanks. The building was quiet. No wind, unusual for Fairbanks in spring, but not impossible. The apartment felt small. My ears ached with the pressure I recognized. I lay in bed next to my sleeping wife and counted to 97. I didn't hear anything. The pressure faded. The building's heating system clicked on. I lay there for another hour, listening to the ordinary sounds of an ordinary building in an ordinary city 500 miles from the coast. And I thought about Mary Tagalic, saying the dangerous time was when it started to sound like something familiar. This morning, I checked the USGS seismic network for any unusual, low-frequency events registered in interior Alaska overnight. There were none. I checked the Fairbanks weather station records for 2 a.m. Wind was calm, temperature -4, nothing anomalous. I checked and checked and checked, and everything was normal, and the data showed nothing, and the instruments heard nothing, and I know exactly what that means now because Ruth told me what it means when the instruments go quiet and the people can still hear it. It means it isn't in the water anymore. I should tell you what happened next. I should have told someone a long time ago, but there was nobody to tell who would have done the right thing with it, and I wasn't sure what the right thing was. I'm still not sure, but Ruth is dead, and the silence I kept for her sake doesn't protect anyone anymore. In August of 2024, 3 months after I felt the pressure in our Fairbanks apartment, Nangarak got a phone call from her cousin Agruk in Utqiagvik. Agruk worked for the borough permitting, nothing to do with wildlife management, and she was not the kind of person who called with gossip or worry. She was practical in a way that made everything she said sound like a weather report. So when she called Nangarak at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday and said, "Ruth Tagalic walked onto the ice 3 days ago and has not come back," it hit like a factual statement about the end of the world. August. Open water season. There was no continuous ice within walking distance of Utqiagvik in August. There hadn't been for years. The shore-fast ice breaks up in June or July, and by August the nearest pack ice is tens of miles offshore, often more. You cannot walk onto ice in August from Utqiagvik. There is no ice to walk onto. Nangarak asked Agruk to repeat what she'd said. Agruk repeated it. Ruth had left her house on the evening of August 9th. Her truck was found at the boat launch near Browerville, the old section of town closest to the water. Her coat was on the passenger seat. Her phone was in the coat. She was wearing, according to her neighbor who saw her leave, rubber boots and a fleece pullover. No survival gear, no pack. August 9th had been overcast, 38 degrees, wind from the east at 12 knots. She walked to the boat launch, left her truck, and was not seen again. There was no boat missing. There was no ice. There was open ocean. Search and rescue deployed within 12 hours of her being reported missing. Coast Guard, Borough SAR, village volunteers. They searched the shoreline east and west. They searched by boat offshore. A helicopter flew the coast from Skull Cliff to Plover Point. Nothing, no body, no clothing, no tracks beyond the gravel at the boat launch, which showed boot prints leading to the water's edge and not returning. I booked a flight to Utqiagvik the next morning. Nangarak came with me. We didn't discuss it. She packed a bag and I packed a bag and we drove to the airport and flew to Fairbanks and then to Utqiagvik on the afternoon Raven, Alaska flight that lands on the gravel strip west of town. It was the first time I'd been back in over a year. Utqiagvik in August looks nothing like Utqiagvik in winter. The light is constant, not midnight sun anymore by August, but long days, golden light slanting across the tundra, the lagoons bright and open, snow geese staging in the wetlands south of town. The ocean was dark and flat and free of ice as far as the horizon. I stood on the tarmac and looked north and saw open water and thought about Ruth walking toward it in rubber boots and a fleece. We stayed with Nangarok's mother in the house on Stevenson Street. The house was small and crowded. 2 of Nangarok's nieces were there, and Agruk came by that evening with food, and the kitchen filled with voices and the smell of caribou stew and the particular warmth of a house where people are functioning through grief by keeping each other fed. Nobody mentioned Ruth directly until the nieces went to bed. Then Nangarok's mother, whose name was Siku, sat down across from me and said, "You worked with Ruth." It was not a question. I said I had. She said, "On the sound." I said yes. She looked at Nangarok and something passed between them. Not a glance I could read, but a communication I recognized from years of watching this family operate. A transfer of permission or responsibility or both. Siku said Ruth had come to see her in July. This was unusual. Ruth and Siku were not close. They knew each other the way everyone in a town of 4,500 knows each other, but they didn't visit. Ruth had come to the house on Stevenson Street and asked Siku about Mary Tagalog. Mary had died in March of 2023, pneumonia, age, the accumulation of a hard life in a hard place. Ruth had been managing her mother's death the way she managed everything, quietly, procedurally, without visible fracture. But in July of 2024 she came to Siku's house and asked her whether Mary had ever talked to her about the sound. Siku said no. Mary had not talked to her about the sound. But Siku knew about it anyway because her own mother had known about it, and her mother's aunt before that, and the knowledge was not exclusive to any single family. It was distributed, held in pieces. No one person carried the whole account. That was deliberate, Siku said. The knowledge was kept distributed because a complete understanding was itself dangerous. Not metaphorically dangerous. Not spiritually dangerous in the way outsiders might assume indigenous caution always meant something vague and symbolic. Dangerous the way a loaded rifle is dangerous. The understanding, fully assembled, did something. It changed what you heard. I asked Siku what she meant by that. She said that the sound Naluagningnig was not a recording. It was not a signal traveling through water and hitting a hydrophone and being captured as data. It was a relationship. It existed between the source and the listener. And like any relationship, it developed. The more you listened, the more it gave you. The more it gave you, the more you could hear. The more you could hear, the more of your own capacity to hear became occupied by it, until eventually it was the only thing you could hear. And then you went to find it. Not because it called you, because the silence of everything else became unbearable. I sat in that kitchen and felt the floor shift under me, not physically, but the way the ground shifts when you realize you've been standing on something you mistook for solid earth, and it is not solid and has not been solid for some time. I asked Siku if she believed that was what had happened to Ruth. She said she didn't believe or disbelieve. She said Ruth had been listening to the sound professionally for over 2 decades, longer than anyone else in the borough's monitoring program. She said Ruth had maintained the hydrophone array, reviewed every recording, run every detection algorithm. She had more cumulative exposure to the signal than anyone alive. And in July, Ruth had come to Siku's house looking for the pieces of understanding that she didn't have, the pieces held by other families, other elders, the distributed knowledge that was kept apart precisely so no one person could assemble the complete picture. I asked if Ruth had gotten what she came for. Siku said no. She said she told Ruth what she knew, which was partial and insufficient, and she told Ruth to stop listening. And Ruth had thanked her and left, and Siku had not seen her again. That night, I lay in the narrow bed in the back room of Siku's house and could not sleep. Nangarak was beside me, also awake. I could tell by her breathing. The light through the window was the gray gold of an August night in Utqiagvik, never fully dark, the sun just below the horizon, the sky luminous. The house ticked and settled. Somewhere outside a dog barked. Nangarak said without preamble, "You listened to it too." I said I had. She knew this. I'd told her about the recordings, about the analysis, about being removed from the project. She said, "How many times?" I thought about it. The original playback in the kitchen. The 6 times that first night in Audacity. Dozens of times during the analysis period isolating frequency bands, running spectral comparisons, checking the autocorrelation. The 5th detection I'd listened to lived through the automated alert system, and then the time it came through the wall of our house. I said I didn't know the exact number. 40 times, 50, maybe more. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You hear it now, don't you?" I did not answer her. I didn't answer because the answer was complicated, and the complicated part was that I wasn't sure. Since the night in May, when I'd felt the pressure in the Fairbanks apartment, I'd been aware of something at the edge of my hearing. Not the signal itself, not the pulsing layered structure I could identify with certainty, but a thinning of ordinary sound, as if everything I heard was slightly less substantial than it used to be. Music sounded fine, conversation sounded fine, but there were moments always at night, always when the ambient noise was low, when I became aware of a texture behind the silence. Not a sound, a readiness, as if the air was shaped to receive something that hadn't arrived yet. "Yes," I said. Nangarak got out of bed. She dressed in the dark. She told me to get dressed. I did. She led me out of the house into the August half-light, and we walked 3 blocks to the Presbyterian church on Apayok Street. It was after midnight. The church was unlocked. Churches in Utqiagvik often are. We went inside. It was empty and smelled like floor polish and old hymnal paper and cold air that had come in through a window left cracked. Nangarak sat in a pew near the back, and I sat beside her, and she told me something she had never told me in 9 years of marriage. She said she had heard the sound when she was 11 years old. Not from a recording, not through a hydrophone. From the ocean, standing on the shore fast ice with her father during spring whaling. April of 1997. They were at the lead edge, the open crack in the ice where the bowhead whales surface during migration, where the whaling crews wait with their boats and their harpoons and their patience. It was 2 a.m., and the light was coming back, not sunrise, but the pale luminance of the Arctic returning from polar night, the horizon going from black to blue. Her father was watching the lead. She was supposed to be sleeping in the tent set back from the ice edge, but she'd come out because she heard something. She said the sound came from below the ice. It was faint. It sounded, and here she stopped and pressed her hands flat against the pew in front of her and took a breath that sounded like a bowhead calling from directly under their feet, which was impossible. A bowhead in the lead would surface in the open water. A bowhead under the shorefast ice would be traveling and would not stop to vocalize. What she heard was stationary, directly below, and it was not a bowhead. She knew this because she'd grown up listening to bowhead recordings in her father's study and on the Burrow office tapes, and this was close but wrong. The overtones didn't match, the rhythm was different, the duration was too precise. She told her father. He came to listen. He put his ear against the ice. He stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds. Then he stood up and took her hand and walked her back to the tent without saying anything. He woke the rest of the crew. Within 20 minutes they were packing up. The entire whaling camp. They left the ice and went home. Her father did not go back out that season. He told the other captains the ice was unstable, which it wasn't. He told her mother the conditions weren't right, which they were. He told Nangarak nothing at all. He died in 2016. Heart disease, the same thing that takes so many men on the North Slope. He never spoke about that night on the ice, but Nangarak said that after 1997, her father stopped whaling in the spring. He still led a crew in the fall hunt when the whales are taken from boats in open water. He never went back on the shore-fast ice for spring whaling. He had a reason, she said, but the reason was his, and he kept it. And she had not told me about hearing the sound because she did not know, until I came home in 2022 and told her about the hydrophone data, that there was a sound to tell about. She had filed it as a childhood memory of something inexplicable and sealed it away the way her father had sealed away the spring season. I asked her why she was telling me now, in a church at 1 a.m. She said because the church was the only building in Utqiagvik that had been built by people who didn't know about the sound. Everything else, every house, every community building, every structure that had been placed here by the Inupiaq families who built the town over generations, was positioned with knowledge of the coastline's relationship to the thing in the water. The church was built by Presbyterians from the lower 48 in 1899 and placed where they placed it because they liked the view. It was, she said, the only building in town that was acoustically naive. I did not know what she meant by that. She didn't explain. We went back to Siku's house. In the morning, I went to the Borough Wildlife Management office. The director I'd worked with was no longer there. He'd retired in 2023. The new director was a younger man named Samuel Akakok. I knew him slightly. He was competent and careful, and wore the same expression of calibrated neutrality that everyone in that office seemed to develop. I told Samuel I was in town because of Ruth. He said he understood. I asked him what had happened with the acoustic monitoring program since Ruth's disappearance. He said the program was suspended pending a review. The nearshore array was deployed, but not being actively monitored. There was no one to replace Ruth. She'd been the only person with the technical expertise to maintain the detection algorithms and process the raw data. He said the borough was in contact with the university about finding someone to take over the program, but it would take months. I asked if I could review the recent hydrophone data, the recordings from the weeks before Ruth disappeared. He studied me for a long time. Then he said no. I asked why. He said, because of what happened last time. He meant my contact with PMEL. He said the borough's position had not changed. He said the data was the borough's. He said he was sorry about Ruth and that the community was grieving and that my presence was appreciated for Nangarak's family's sake, but that my professional involvement with the acoustic program was over. I left the office and walked. Utqiagvik is small. You can walk the whole of it in an hour, from Browerville in the south to the NARL research campus in the north. I walked to the boat launch where Ruth's truck had been found. The truck was gone by then, moved by her family, but the gravel lot was empty and the water was right there, 100 feet from where I stood, flat and dark and limitless. The wind was from the northeast. The air smelled like salt and mud and the faint petrochemical note of the nearby Dew Line cleanup site. I stood and looked at the water and tried to understand what Ruth had walked toward. I knew the answer. I'd known it since Sikud told me about distributed knowledge. Ruth had been listening for over 20 years. She had more exposure than anyone. And at some point, maybe in the months after I left, maybe in the winter of 2023 to 24, maybe when her mother died and the grief opened something that professionalism had been holding shut, the sound had become the dominant signal in her auditory world. Not the loudest sound. the most coherent one, everything else thinning to noise around it, until the only place that sounded like anything was the water. I went back to Siku's house. It was mid-afternoon. The house was empty except for Siku, who was sitting at the kitchen table cutting dried fish with a curved ulu knife. I sat down across from her. She pushed a plate of fish toward me. I ate. She said, without looking up from her cutting, "You want to hear the rest of it." I said I wanted to hear whatever she would tell me. She set down the knife. She said the distributed knowledge the pieces held by different families had been kept separate for as long as anyone could account for. Generations, maybe centuries. Each family's piece was different. Some families held knowledge about the timing when it came, how long it stayed, what the intervals meant. Some held knowledge about the geography, where it traveled, where it was strongest, where the shore was safe and where it wasn't. Some held knowledge about what it did to people. And one family, Ruth's family, the Tagalog line, held the piece that was considered the most dangerous. The Tagalog piece was this: the sound could be answered. Not answered the way you answer a phone or a radio call. Answered acoustically. There was a specific vocalization, Siku did not know it, and did not want to know it, that, when produced by a human voice at the water's edge, would cause the sound to respond. Not just repeat, respond. Alter its structure in reaction to the human input. Enter into an exchange. And the exchange, according to what Siku had been told by her mother, who had been told by hers, was the mechanism by which the thing in the water learned. Learned what? I asked. Learned to sound like us, Siku said. Learned to match the frequency range of human hearing. Learned to produce patterns that human auditory processing would interpret as coherent, as structured, as meaningful. Each exchange taught it more. Each response it gave was closer to something a human brain would lock onto and be unable to release. The 1978 to 79 events, the hunters who followed what they thought was a bowhead that had happened after a known exchange. Someone had answered it. Not maliciously, out of curiosity or grief, or the same compulsion that made me play the recording 40 times in my kitchen, and after being answered it had gotten better at pretending to be a whale. Mary Tagalog had known this. She had carried this piece of the distributed knowledge her entire life. She had understood that her family's piece was the dangerous one, the instruction manual, the key that could make everything worse. And she had told Ruth. And Ruth, who was a scientist, who believed in measurement, who had spent 20 years listening to the ocean through instruments that were supposed to put distance between her and whatever she heard, Ruth had the answer in her mother's voice, and the question in her headphones, and at some point the wall between knowing how to respond and actually responding had come down. I asked Siku if she was saying Ruth had answered the sound. Siku picked up the ulu and resumed cutting fish. She said she didn't know what Ruth had done. She said she knew that in the weeks before Ruth disappeared, 2 elders in Wainwright had independently reported hearing something from the water that sounded different from any previous occurrence. Not the usual deep pulsing. Something higher. Something that, according to one of the elders, sounded like a woman humming. The kitchen was very quiet. The only sound was the ulu against the cutting board in the furnace and the wind against the window. I sat there and felt the sentence settle into me. A woman humming. A sound that learned. A scientist who'd listened for 20 years and then gone to the water. I spent 3 more days in Utqiagvik. The search for Ruth had been officially suspended, no body, no evidence, no leads. Her house was being looked after by a cousin. The Wildlife Management Office had her personal effects from her desk in boxes. I did not ask to see them. I did not ask to access the hydrophone data again. What I did on the second evening was walk to the water. It was not a plan. It was not a decision I remember making. Nang Gawrak was at her mother's house. The light was the same gray gold of a continuous August twilight. I walked from Stevenson Street north toward the old NARL campus and then turned west toward the point. The ground was soft tundra, the active layer thawed to mud, tussocks and puddles, and the low scrub of the coastal plain. I walked until I reached the bluff above the beach, where the tundra drops 5 or 6 feet to the gravel shore and the ocean begins. I stood at the edge and looked at the water. The Chukchi Sea in August is not beautiful in the way mountains or forests are beautiful. It is flat. It is gray. It extends to the horizon in every direction with a uniformity that erases scale. You cannot tell if you're looking at 1 mile of water or 100. The sky and the water merge at a line so faint it seems theoretical. The wind was light. Small waves lapped the gravel. A few eider ducks rode the surface 100 meters out. I stood there and listened. At first, I heard what anyone would hear. Waves, wind, the eiders. A distant four-wheeler somewhere in town, the ambient texture of a coastal evening. Then, gradually, the way your eyes adjust to darkness, I became aware of the thing behind the sound. Not the signal, not the 97-second structured pulse I could identify on a spectrogram. Something subtler, a thinning, as if the ambient noise, the waves, the wind, the birds, was being gently attenuated, turned down by fractions of a decibel, and in the space that opened up there was a frequency I couldn't quite resolve. Not silence, the opposite of silence. A density. A sound too low to hear, but present enough to feel in the bones of my jaw and the fluid behind my eyes. The eiders went quiet. I noticed it because I'd been using their calls as an anchor, a known biological signal, familiar, identifiable. When they stopped, I noticed. I looked out at the water, and the eiders were still there, floating, but silent. And the waves seemed quieter, though they were the same size, and the wind was still blowing, but I couldn't hear it in my ears anymore. I felt the pressure. The same ear pressure from the apartment in Fairbanks. The same spatial compression. The room getting smaller. Except I was outdoors on an open coastline with the entire Arctic Ocean in front of me, and the sensation was of the horizon pulling inward, of the distance between me and the water contracting, of the world becoming a smaller and more focused space with me at one end and something I couldn't see at the other. And then Nengarak's hand was on my arm. She was beside me. She'd followed me. She told me later that she'd seen me leave the house and watched me walk toward the water and known with the certainty that comes from growing up in a place where this knowledge is in the walls, that I was not walking to the water by choice. She said I'd been standing at the bluff edge for 20 minutes when she reached me. I thought it had been 2. She pulled me back from the edge. Not gently. She gripped my arm hard enough to leave bruises. I saw them the next morning. 4 finger-shaped marks above my elbow. She turned me around and walked me back toward town, and she did not speak to me until we were inside the church on Apayok Street, the building placed by people who didn't know, and she sat me in a pew and stood over me and said, "We are leaving tomorrow." I looked at her, and what I saw in her face was not fear. It was decision. The hard, clean expression of someone who has calculated the cost of every option and chosen the one that preserves the most. She had spent our entire marriage watching me from a position of knowledge she hadn't shared. And now the knowledge was irrelevant because the situation had moved past the point where knowing helped, and what was left was action. I said, "Okay," she said, "you don't get to come back here." I said, "Okay," she said, "and you stop listening." I asked her what that meant. She said it meant no recordings, no spectrograms, no acoustic files, no NOAA databases, no frequencies, no analysis, no measurement. She said measurement was listening and listening was answering, and I had already listened too much and the thing in the water had already learned too much from me. She said Ruth had been a better scientist than me and it hadn't mattered. We flew back to Fairbanks the next afternoon. On the plane, the small turboprop that hops from Utqiagvik to Fairbanks in 3 hours, I sat in a window seat and looked down at the North Slope unrolling beneath us. The tundra, the river braids, the lakes like scattered coins. Then the Brooks Range, white and vast. Then the boreal forest south of the range, spruce thickening as we descended. The landscape scrolled beneath me, and I tried to feel the distance growing between me and the coast. 300 miles, 400, 500. The pressure in my ears didn't change. I did what Nangarak told me. I deleted the analysis files from my laptop. I took the encrypted drive from the locked drawer and put it in a box and sealed the box and gave it to Nangarak. And she took it somewhere and I did not ask where. I unsubscribed from the PMEL mailing list. I removed the acoustic analysis software from my computer. I stopped checking the NOAA hydrophone database. I stopped checking the USGS seismic network. I stopped checking. For 3 months it was almost normal. I taught my classes. Nangarak worked at the health consortium. We had dinner. We walked the dog along the Chena River in the early fall when the birch trees go yellow and the air smells like cold water and leaf decay. I did not think about the sound. Or I thought about it the way you think about anything you've decided not to think about, which is to say I thought about the border of it, the shape of the space where it used to be, without entering the space itself. In November, 2 things happened. The first, I was in my office at the university, grading lab reports, when I received an email from a name I didn't recognize. A researcher at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. She said she was part of a team that had deployed a deep-water acoustic mooring in the Beaufort Sea in September 2024 as part of a climate monitoring project, and that the mooring had recorded an anomalous signal of significant duration and spectral complexity. She said she had contacted PMEL and obtained a copy of the 2021 H11 detection memo. She said the spectral signatures were consistent. She said they had now recorded the signal 7 times between September and November, at intervals of approximately 9 days, and that preliminary analysis suggested a mobile source tracking south-southeast along the continental margin at an estimated speed of 0.4 knots. She said the signal duration varied between their detections, from 97 seconds to, in the most recent recording, 194 seconds. Double the original duration. She wanted to know if I had any data from the nearshore array that might help triangulate the source position. She had found my name on a 5-year-old co-author list for a North Slope Burrow whale census report. I read the email and felt the pressure build behind my eyes, and I closed the laptop and walked out of my office and stood in the hallway of the Irving building and breathed. The intervals had been 97 days, then 22, then 16, then 10, and now 9. And the duration had doubled from 97 seconds to 194. It was getting faster, and it was talking longer. And 0.4 knots. Faster than before. When I tracked it, it was 0.3. It was speeding up. I did not reply to the email. The second thing that happened in November, I stopped being able to hear the dog. Our dog was a 10-year-old husky mix named Pukak. She snored. She snored loud enough that Nangarak made me move her bed into the hallway because she couldn't sleep. I could hear Pukak snoring from any room in the apartment. It was one of the constants of our domestic life, as reliable as the furnace clicking on. On November 14th, I realized I couldn't hear her. She was in the hallway, asleep, snoring. I could see her ribcage rising and falling. I could see the vibration in her jowls. But the sound was absent. Not quiet. Absent. I knelt next to her and put my ear near her muzzle. Nothing. I put my hand on her throat and felt the vibration. The sound was being produced. I couldn't hear it. I went to the kitchen and turned on the faucet. I could hear the water. I clapped my hands. I could hear the clap. I turned on the radio, a Fairbanks classic rock station, the only one that came in clearly. I could hear it. I went back to Pukak. Silence. Over the next week, the silence spread. Not to everything, to specific things. The furnace, I couldn't hear it anymore, though I could feel the warm air and see the thermostat cycling. The refrigerator hum gone. The sound of Nangarok's breathing when she slept beside me gone. I lay next to my wife in the dark and could not hear her breathe and had to put my hand on her chest to know she was alive. What I could still hear, my own voice, traffic, music if it was playing, the specific high-frequency sounds of objects striking objects, keys on a table, a pen clicking, a door closing, anything percussive, anything sharp-edged and transient. What I was losing was the continuous sounds, the drones, the hums, the respirations, the low, sustained frequencies that form the background of a life lived inside walls. I was losing the floor. The acoustic floor of ordinary existence was being stripped away, and in the space it left, I could feel the other thing, the readiness, the shaped absence, the density that wasn't silence, but was waiting to not be silence. I told Nangarok. I told her I was losing my hearing selectively and that the pattern of loss was consistent with something filtering out low-frequency continuous signals and leaving everything else. She listened. She didn't cry. She went to the closet and came back with the sealed box, the one I'd given her, the one with the encrypted drive. It was unopened. She set it on the kitchen table and said, "This isn't enough." I didn't understand. She said deleting files and avoiding databases wasn't enough because the listening had already happened. The exposure had already occurred. 40, 50, maybe more playbacks of the original signal, plus the one that came through the wall, plus the 20 minutes at the bluff edge. The relationship was already established. The sound had already mapped my auditory system. It already knew which frequencies I used to orient, to feel safe, to understand my environment as stable and inhabited, and it was removing them, one by one, replacing them with itself. The continuous sounds going first because those were the frequencies closest to its own operating range, the low, sustained, pulsing structure that was its native format. She said her father had known this. That was why he'd stopped spring whaling after 1997. Not because he was afraid of the ice, because he'd listened through the ice that night, put his ear against it, and afterward he couldn't hear whale calls anymore. The bowhead songs he'd spent his life listening for gone, replaced by a silence that was shaped like the other thing. He could hear everything else. He could hear his crew, the wind, the dogs, his daughter. But when a bowhead surfaced in the lead and exhaled and called, he heard nothing. The sound had taken the frequency space that whales lived in and occupied it, and because he could no longer hear the whales, he could no longer hunt them. He couldn't find them. He couldn't follow their voices through the ice the way his father and grandfather had. The sound had severed the oldest connection his family had to the ocean and replaced it with a connection to itself. I asked Nangarok why she hadn't told me this before we went to Utqiagvik, before I walked to the bluff, before any of it. She said because she'd hoped I hadn't listened enough for it to matter. She said she'd been watching me since 2022, when I first brought the analysis home, watching for signs that my hearing was changing. Well, she said for 2 years she hadn't seen any, and she'd thought maybe the recordings, mediated through electronics, converted to digital, played back through speakers and headphones, didn't carry the same weight as hearing it live from the water. She said she'd been wrong. She said the night in our Fairbanks apartment, When the sound came through the wall, that was when the relationship became live. That was when it stopped being data and started being a conversation. She asked me what I still couldn't hear. I told her the list. She nodded at each item as if checking it against an expected sequence. When I finished, she asked me if I could still hear her voice. I said yes. She said, for now. We sat in the kitchen. It was late November, dark by 3 p.m. in Fairbanks. The window showed nothing but our own reflection in the orange glow of the streetlight on the snow. Nang Garak held my hands and told me what her family's piece of the distributed knowledge was. Every family held a piece. Ruth's family held the answer, the vocalization that could make it respond. Siku's line held the geography where it traveled, where the coast was safe. And Nangarak's family, the family of whaling captains who had hunted bowhead from the ice for longer than the burrow had existed, held the remedy. Not a cure, a severance. A way to end the relationship between the sound and a listener, to cut the connection before the listener lost enough of the acoustic floor that the sound became the only thing left. It was not gentle, it was not without cost, but it worked. The remedy was deafness, not gradual hearing loss, not age-related decline, total, sudden, permanent deafness induced by trauma. Her father had considered it in 1997 when he realized he could no longer hear the whales. He'd decided against it because the loss was limited. He could still hear everything except bowhead vocalizations, and he could live with that. He'd accepted the partial occupation of his hearing because the alternative was losing all of it. But the partial occupation, Nangarak said, only held if you stopped listening, if you stayed away from the water, if you never played a recording, if you never ran a spectrogram, if you let the relationship go dormant. Her father had done that. He'd sacrificed the spring hunt and kept the rest of his hearing for the remaining 19 years of his life. I had not done that. I had played the recording 50 times. I had analyzed the waveform for weeks. I had walked to the water and stood there while it pulled the ambient world out from under me. And now it was taking my hearing frequency by frequency, and eventually it would take all the continuous sounds and then the transient ones, and then Nangarak's voice, and then my own. And what would be left would be the signal and nothing else. And I would go to the water the way Ruth had gone because the water would be the only place that wasn't silent. Nangarak said this plainly, the way her family said difficult things without ornament, without softening, with the respect of assuming the listener can bear the truth. She said the choice was mine. She said if I chose the severance, the deafness, it would have to be done by someone who knew how, and the person who knew how was in Utqiagvik, and I would have to go back to the coast one more time. I asked who. She said her uncle, the whaling captain. He had performed the severance once before, in the 1980s, on a man from Wainwright who had answered the sound during the same cycle that took the 3 hunters in 1979. I asked what happened to that man. Nangarak said he was alive. He was 71 years old and lived in Anchorage and was completely deaf and had been since 1984. He was alive. He had not gone to the water. The connection was severed. I spent a week deciding. During that week, I lost the sound of the dishwasher, the bathroom fan, the clothes dryer, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights in my university office. The world was becoming percussive and sharp and increasingly hollow. I could still hear voices. I could still hear music, but only the higher register's bass was fading. I could hear the click of my keyboard, but not the fan of my laptop. I stood in my classroom and lectured to students who heard me fine, and I heard their questions clearly. But the background of the room, the HVAC, the projector fan, the ambient hum that tells you you're in a building, was gone. On November 29th, I told Nangarak I wanted the severance. We flew to Utqiagvik on December 2nd. Polar night. The sun had set for the last time on November 18th and wouldn't rise again until January 23rd. The town was dark. The temperature was -22. The wind was 25 knots from the east and the wind chill was in the -50s. We went to her uncle's house on Momagana Street. His name was Malik. He was 68, heavy, quiet, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from driftwood. He did not greet me warmly. He didn't greet me at all. He looked at Nangarak, and they spoke in Inupiaq, and then he looked at me and said in English, "Sit down." I will not describe what he did. Nangarak asked me not to, and I agree it should not be described, because the description would be another form of transmission. I will say it took less than 10 minutes. I will say it involved my being in a specific room, not in his house, but in an older structure, a semi-subterranean space that might have been an ice cellar or might have been something older, and I will say that the last thing I heard was Nangarak saying my name. And then I heard nothing, and I have heard nothing since. The audiologist in Fairbanks classified it as sudden bilateral sensorineural hearing loss of unknown etiology. Profound. Total. Both ears. No response at any frequency at maximum output. She referred me to an otolaryngologist in Anchorage who ran an MRI and found no structural abnormality, no tumor, no evidence of trauma, no vascular event. The cochlear structures appeared intact. The auditory nerve appeared intact. The hair cells, as far as imaging could determine, were undamaged. There was simply no signal reaching the brain. The hardware was present and functional. The connection had been severed at a level the imaging couldn't see. I was offered cochlear implants. I declined. Nangarak and I discussed it. She said the implants would create a new auditory pathway, electronic, digital, mediated by a processor. She said she didn't know if that pathway would be vulnerable to the same occupation as biological hearing. She said she wasn't willing to find out. I agreed. I am writing this in February of 2025 from our apartment in Fairbanks. I communicate with Nangarak by handwriting, by text, and by a growing facility with ASL that we are both learning. I no longer teach. I took medical leave and will likely not return. I am applying for positions that do not require hearing. I walk the dog. I watch the snow fall on the Chena River without hearing it. I live in a world of perfect, absolute silence, and inside that silence there is nothing. No pressure, no readiness, no density waiting to become sound. The severance held. The connection is cut. Whatever the sound learned from me, whatever frequencies it mapped, whatever patterns it extracted from 50 playbacks and 3 months of analysis, it learned from a listener it can no longer reach. I believe it is still out there. The Woods Hole researchers' email described 7 detections through November 2024, and if the pattern held, there have been more since then. The intervals were 9 days and shrinking. The duration was doubling. The speed was increasing. It is coming south along the shelf break, and it has been answered by Ruth or by someone else, someone who held the Tagalog family's piece of the knowledge and used it, and it is now better at sounding like the things we listen for. Whales, wind, water, breathing. I cannot verify this. I cannot hear it. I will never hear anything again. But last week, Nangarak woke me at 3 a.m. by shaking my shoulder. She was sitting up in bed. Her face, in the blue light of the clock, had the expression I'd seen on Ruth Tagalog in the hallway of the wildlife management office, the expression of someone encountering data that doesn't belong in their framework. I asked her what was wrong. She wrote on the notepad we keep on the nightstand. She wrote, "I hear something." I wrote back, "What?" She held the pen for a long time, then she wrote, "It sounds like you."